It was a relic of a life now over, plastic and steel, destined for spare parts, a gift to charity from a grieving father. But there was something wrong, a slight rattle, a muffled sound from within the hollow frame that shouldn't have been there. For 20 years, a brother named Leo Hayes had searched for his sister. For 20 years, he had been haunted by the ghost of a girl who simply vanished. The police had their theories, the family had their suspicions, but the truth was sealed away, hidden by a quiet, meticulous old man who believed his secret would die with him. He was wrong. What was found inside that leg would not only reopen a cold case, it would unmask a monster hiding in plain sight for 2 decades. The story of what happened to Amelia Hayes is about more than just a disappearance. It's about a secret kept, a life stolen, and a truth more horrifying than anyone was prepared for. In the autumn of 1996, Eugene, Oregon, was a city painted in shades of damp earth and dying leaves. The rain felt different there. It wasn't an interruption to the day. It was the day's steady, quiet rhythm, a constant companion that washed the streets clean and fed the mossy greens of the Pacific Northwest. For Amelia Hayes, the rain was the soundtrack to her dreams. At 19, she moved through the city like she owned its secrets, her worn copy of a poetry anthology always tucked into her bag. She was a literature student, but more than that, she was a collector of moments, of words, of the way the light hit the wet pavement outside the campus bookstore. Amelia, or Amy as her brother called her, had a specific kind of energy. It wasn't loud or demanding of attention, but it was vibrant, a low hum of excitement for a future she was meticulously planning in the margins of her notebooks. She saw her life as a story waiting to be written, and she was just finishing the first few chapters. Leave her small hometown, get into a good university, and fall in love with a city where she could be anonymous and entirely herself at the same time. She worked 20 hours a week at a small independent coffee shop called The Daily Grind, a place that smelled of burnt coffee beans and cinnamon, where the steam from the espresso machine fogged up the windows and softened the world outside. On the evening of October 12th, a Saturday, the coffee shop was quiet. The last of the afternoon regulars had long since departed, leaving behind the lingering scent of their coffee and the echo of their conversations. Amelia was wiping down the stainless steel counter, her movements practiced and efficient. Her last phone call of the night had been to her brother, Leo, who was 4 hours away in Portland, building a career that felt a million miles away from her world of poetry and term papers. He was 24, and in that classic older brother way, he carried a self-imposed burden of responsibility for her. He worried. He'd just gotten a promotion at the architectural firm where he worked, and the call was full of his characteristic blend of excitement and anxiety. "You should see the models for this new building, Amy," he'd said, his voice crackling slightly over the line. "It's all glass and steel, right on the waterfront. It's a monster." She had laughed, a sound like wind chimes. "Is that a good thing? You sound like you're building a cage for King Kong." "It's a good thing. A very good thing. It means I can finally afford to fly you home for Christmas instead of you taking that miserable bus." "I like the bus," she'd replied, though they both knew it was a lie. "It makes me feel like a character in a movie, leaving town to find my destiny." "Your destiny is to get a degree, without getting pneumonia in that perpetually damp city," he'd countered. "Just be safe, okay? Did you get the oil in your car changed like I told you?" "Yes, Dad," she teased. "I'm a responsible adult. Now I have to go. My last customer is here. I'll call you tomorrow." "Okay. Love you, Amy." "Love you too, Leo." That was the last time he would ever hear her voice. The last customer was a fiction she created to end the call, a small, meaningless lie that would later grow into a source of immense, irrational guilt for Leo. After hanging up, she finished her closing duties, pulled on her worn denim jacket, and stepped out of the warm, bright sanctuary of the coffee shop into the cool, misty Oregon night. The streetlights cast long, hazy halos on the slick asphalt. Her shift was over. She started the short, familiar walk toward the bus stop that would take her back to her small apartment near the university, a place filled with stacks of books and the faint, sweet scent of the jasmine plant she kept on her windowsill. And then, somewhere in those few blocks between the light of the cafe and the presumed safety of the bus, Amelia Hayes stepped out of the world. She simply vanished. The call came to Leo at 2:17 a.m. It was a number he didn't recognize, a landline from Eugene. He answered on the third ring, his mind thick with sleep. It was a police officer. The words were calm, procedural, but they landed like stones in the silence of his apartment. Amelia hadn't shown up for her morning study group. Her roommate, concerned, had called the campus police. They had visited the apartment. Amelia wasn't there. Her bed hadn't been slept in. Panic is a cold, smooth liquid that fills you from the inside out. Leo was dressed and in his car in less than 10 minutes, his hands shaking so violently he could barely fit the key into the ignition. The 4-hour drive south on Interstate 5 became a tunnel of darkness, the only reality being the twin beams of his headlights cutting through the black, rainy night. His mind raced, replaying their last conversation, dissecting every word. Why did she get off the phone so quickly? Who was she meeting? He toggled between a frantic, desperate hope that this was all a misunderstanding and a deep, primal fear that it wasn't. He pictured her at the bus stop alone. He saw her face, the way she would tuck a strand of hair behind her ear when she was nervous. He cursed himself for being so far away, for letting her live alone in a city he barely knew. Every mile marker he passed was a tick of a clock that was moving too fast, taking her further and further away from him. When he finally arrived in Eugene, the sun was a weak, gray smear in the eastern sky. He met the officers at Amelia's apartment building. The front door to her unit was slightly ajar. A piece of yellow police tape stretched across it, a violation of the space that made his stomach clench. Inside, the air was still and cold. It smelled like her, that mix of jasmine and old books. It was a scent that, for the rest of his life, would trigger a wave of nausea. Her world was exactly as she had left it. A half-finished mug of tea sat on the small kitchen table. A book lay face down on her unmade bed, its spine cracked, holding her place. Her keys and wallet were missing, but everything else was there. Her backpack for class, her worn-out running shoes by the door, the collection of mismatched postcards she'd tacked to a corkboard above her desk. Leo walked through the small space, a ghost in his own sister's life. He touched the sleeve of a sweater draped over a chair, half expecting her to walk out of the bathroom and ask him what he was doing there. But the apartment remained silent. It was a silence that was fundamentally wrong. It wasn't empty. It was hollowed out. It was the sound of an absence. Standing in the middle of his sister's room, surrounded by all the proof of her vibrant, ongoing life, Leo Hayes felt the first true wave of terror. This wasn't a misunderstanding. She wasn't coming back. She was gone. And in that moment, his world, like hers, fractured into a million unrecognizable pieces. The search for Amelia had just begun, but for Leo, the long, cold desert of uncertainty had already arrived. The first few weeks of the investigation were a storm of frantic activity. Police cruisers lined the street outside Amelia's apartment, their flashing lights painting the rainy nights in strokes of red and blue. News vans camped out nearby, reporters with sympathetic faces speaking in hushed tones about the missing co-ed. Volunteers, mostly students with hopeful, worried eyes, combed through the dense, wet woods at the edge of the city, their shouts of "Amelia!" swallowed by the towering pines. For Leo, this period was a blur of sleeplessness and bad coffee, lived in the sterile environment of police conference rooms. He answered the same questions 100 times. No, Amelia wasn't depressed. No, she didn't have any enemies he knew of. Yes, she was responsible, she always called. The lead detectives, a pair of weary, overworked men named Thompson and Riley, quickly zeroed in on Amelia's ex-boyfriend. It was standard procedure, the path of least resistance. They had dated for 6 months, and the breakup a few weeks before her disappearance had been messy. Leo knew it was a dead end. He had talked to his sister about it. She had been more annoyed than heartbroken, frustrated by his immaturity. He tried to explain this to the detectives, presenting them with a timeline of Amelia's last month that he had painstakingly built from her planner and conversations with her friends. They listened with professional patience, thanked him for his efforts, and then politely filed it away, their focus remaining locked on the wrong man. Leo felt a chasm opening between him and the official investigation, a sense of profound helplessness as he watched them waste precious time chasing a ghost. Frustration gave way to a quiet, burning resolve. If the police were going to follow their playbook, he would write his own. He moved into Amelia's apartment, sleeping on her couch, immersing himself in the last vestiges of her life. He read the books on her nightstand, noting the passages she had underlined. He went through her journals, her letters, her class notes, searching for a name, a place, anything that didn't fit. It was there, in the margins of a literature textbook, that he found it. The name Daniel, written inside a small doodled heart. Not the ex-boyfriend, someone else. Her roommate knew the name, Daniel Finch, a quiet boy from her poetry seminar. She felt sorry for him, I think, the roommate said, twisting a ring on her finger. He had that leg, and his dad was super strict. She said he was smart, but really lonely. That was enough. Armed with a name, Leo felt the first flicker of purpose since the night of the phone call. He found the Finch address in a local phone book. The house was in a quiet, older neighborhood, a modest but immaculately kept home. The lawn was perfectly edged, the hedges trimmed with an almost obsessive precision. It was the kind of house that seemed to hold its breath. The man who answered the door was older, slight of build, with thin gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a crisp, button-down shirt, and his hands were clean, his fingernails perfect. This was Alistair Finch. He had a watchmaker's eyes, calm, focused, and missing nothing. His politeness was a shield. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. Leo introduced himself, his own voice sounding rough and loud in the quiet air of the porch. "I'm Amelia Hayes's brother. I was told she was friends with your son, Daniel." Alistair's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes tightened. "My son is not well. He has delicate health. The police have already spoken with him. It was very upsetting." "I understand," Leo pushed, trying to keep his desperation in check. "I just want to ask him a few questions myself. Maybe he remembers something, anything, from that day." Alistair Finch took a small step back, subtly blocking the doorway. "Young man, my son is a sensitive boy. This entire affair has been a terrible shock to him. He told the police he saw Amelia in the library on Friday, the day before she went missing. That is all he knows. I will not have him distressed further by a grieving family member looking for someone to blame." The words were delivered without malice, yet they felt like a perfectly aimed weapon. It was a dismissal so complete, so absolute, that it left no room for argument. "We are praying for your sister's safe return," Alistair added, the sentence hanging in the air like a closing statement. Then he quietly shut the door. Leo stood on the porch for a full minute, the click of the lock echoing in his ears. He hadn't felt threatened, not in a physical sense. He had been managed, handled. He drove away with a sour taste in his mouth, a feeling of unease he couldn't quite name. He had come looking for a clue and had been turned away by a concerned father. It all made sense, and yet it felt profoundly wrong. He didn't know it then, but he had just stood face to face with the man who held all the answers. He had knocked on the door of the monster's house, and the monster had politely told him to go away. As months bled into a year, the storm of the investigation receded into a silent, agonizing fog. The news vans left. The detectives stopped calling. Amelia's case was officially declared cold, a bureaucratic term for a wound that would never be allowed to heal. But for Leo, it was never cold. It was a fire that burned away his old life piece by piece. He lost his promotion at the architectural firm, his focus shattered, his ambition replaced by a singular, all-consuming obsession. He eventually left Amelia's apartment, but took a part of it with him, converting the spare bedroom in his own home into a replica of a police incident room. This became his sanctuary and his prison. One wall was covered by a giant map of Eugene, with red pins marking Amelia's apartment, her workplace, the bus stop. Strings connected them, a web of theories and dead ends. Another wall was a gallery of faces, friends, classmates, the ex-boyfriend, and in the corner, a small, grainy photograph of a quiet, unassuming man with wire-rimmed glasses. Alistair Finch. His social life withered. Friends would call, invite him out, try to talk about anything other than the case, but their efforts were futile. He was a man speaking a language no one else understood, the language of grief, guilt, and suspicion. He was lost in the long gray desert of uncertainty, and he had forgotten how to find his way out. The years passed, 10 years, 15. Leo learned to live with the ghost of his sister. He functioned. He held down a job, but he was a shell. The case room remained his only true companion. He would spend his nights there sifting through the same meager collection of facts, hoping a new connection would magically appear. The day Amelia would have turned 30 was the worst. He bought a single cupcake from a bakery, a small pink candle stuck in the frosting. He sat in the case room, the cupcake on the desk in front of her, smiling high school graduation photo. He didn't light the candle. He just sat there in the dark, the silence of the room a testament to all the years she had missed, all the life that had been stolen from her. It was the anniversary of a life unlived, and the weight of it was suffocating. The world had moved on and forgotten Amelia Hayes, but her brother remained, a lone sentinel, keeping watch over her memory, convinced the truth was still out there, hiding in the shadows, just waiting for a flicker of light. For 20 years, the silence surrounding Amelia Hayes's disappearance was absolute. It was a solid wall, impenetrable and unchanging. And then, on a Tuesday morning in September of 2016, a crack appeared. It didn't happen in a police station or a detective's office. It happened in a dusty, cluttered workshop on the industrial side of Portland, a place filled with the smell of machine oil and disinfectant. The place was called the Second Step Foundation, a nonprofit that took in used medical equipment, wheelchairs, walkers, prosthetics, and refurbished them for people who couldn't afford new ones. It was a place of quiet, practical hope, run by a handful of technicians who believed that nothing and no one was truly broken beyond repair. One of those technicians was a man named Marco, a retired Army medic with hands calloused from decades of fixing things. That morning, he was working on a donation that had been sitting on a shelf for nearly a year, an old prosthetic leg. It was a clunky, outdated model, but its components were still useful. The donation had come from the estate of a man named Daniel Finch, who had passed away from a long illness. The paperwork was simple and unremarkable. Marco worked with practiced efficiency, disassembling the joints, checking the pylons. As he handled the main shaft of the leg, a hollow metal tube, he noticed something, a subtle rattle. It was a sound he shouldn't be hearing. He shook it again, his brow furrowed in concentration. It wasn't a loose screw. It was something inside, something that had been deliberately placed there. His curiosity piqued. He took the prosthetic over to a workbench, laying it under the bright glare of an overhead lamp. His younger colleague, a woman named Sarah, came over to see what he was doing. He pointed to a fine seam near the top of the pylon, almost invisible beneath the cosmetic covering. It wasn't part of the standard design. Using a thin, flexible blade, Marco carefully worked it into the seam. With a soft click, a small section of the frame came loose, revealing a hidden compartment no bigger than a deck of cards. It was a masterful piece of concealment, something a person could own for years and never discover. Marco and Sarah exchanged a look of disbelief. Inside the dark cavity, there was a small, tightly wrapped bundle. With a pair of pliers, Marco gently extracted it. It was a faded piece of fabric, dark denim, wrapped around something hard and rectangular. It felt important. As he carefully unwrapped the cloth, the object inside fell onto the clean surface of the workbench. It was a university ID card, The lamination was yellowed with age, but the face staring up at them was young, vibrant, and frozen in time. A girl with a bright, hopeful smile. The name printed beneath the photo read, Amelia Hayes. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The name was infamous, a ghost story that parents in Oregon still told their kids, the girl who vanished. For a moment, they just stared. And then Marco, with his medic's eye for detail, saw something else. He turned the ID card over, scratched into the plastic on the back, so faintly they were almost invisible, was a series of numbers and letters. It wasn't random. It looked like a license plate. In that moment, the workshop, usually a place of quiet repair, became the epicenter of a 2-decade-old crime. The silence had not just been broken, it had been shattered. The phone call reached Leo Hayes at his desk at a small independent architectural firm. He'd learned to build a life around the edges of his grief, a quiet, contained existence. The call was from a detective, Ava Rossi, a name he didn't know. She was with the Eugene Police Department's cold case unit. The phrase cold case sent an immediate, familiar jolt of dread and cynicism through him. It was a term he associated with dusty file boxes and polite dismissals. Mr. Hayes, Detective Rossi's voice was clear and direct, devoid of the weary sympathy he was used to. Something has come up in relation to your sister's case. An item has been recovered. Leo's breath caught in his throat. He had received calls like this twice before over the years. Both had been false alarms, sightings in other states that led to dead ends and fresh waves of pain. He steeled himself for another. Disappointment. What item? He asked, his voice flat. We can't discuss that over the phone, but we believe it is significant. Would it be possible for you to come down to the station? Something in her tone, a lack of ambiguity, a sharp edge of purpose, was different. Hope, an emotion he had long since buried, began to stir. It was a terrifying feeling, like a phantom limb beginning to ache. He drove to Eugene in a state of suspended disbelief, the 2-hour drive feeling both like an eternity and a few short seconds. The police station was the same building that had been the backdrop to the worst days of his life. But the detective who met him was new. Ava Rossi was young, sharp, and her handshake was firm. She led him not to a sad windowless interview room, but to a bright office where a single evidence bag lay on her desk. Inside the clear plastic was the ID card. Leo stared at it, his heart pounding against his ribs. It was her. It was Amelia. The same photo from her first week. Of college, the one she'd complained about, saying it made her look too eager. He saw the faded denim wrapped around it. He recognized it instantly. It was from the cuff of her favorite jacket, the one she was wearing the night she disappeared. We found it this morning, Rossi explained, her voice gentle now, hidden inside a prosthetic leg that was donated to a charity. Leo looked up from the ID card, his mind struggling to connect the words, a prosthetic leg. The phrase was so bizarre, so grotesquely specific it could only be true, and in that instant a memory 20 years old surfaced from the depths of his mind with stunning clarity. A quiet, immaculately kept house, a polite but firm man standing in a doorway, a son with delicate health. Daniel Finch. He sank into the chair opposite the desk, the strength gone from his legs. It was real. After 20 years of searching in the dark, a light had just been switched on. The ID card on the table wasn't just an object, it was a voice. Amelia's voice echoing out of a long and terrible silence, telling him she hadn't just left, she had been taken. And for the first time in 2 decades, the horror of what might have happened to her was eclipsed by a new, powerful, and dangerous emotion, the possibility of justice. The desert of uncertainty was over. Now he had to cross the landscape of the truth, no matter how terrifying it would be. The Eugene Police Department of 2016 was a different institution from the one Leo had dealt with in 1996. The old, cluttered file rooms had been replaced by the quiet hum of servers. Where detectives once relied on instinct and shoe leather, they now had digital forensics, DNA databases, and a generation of investigators who had grown up with technology as a native language. The Amelia Hayes case file, a dozen dusty cardboard boxes filled with aging paper, was now being scanned, digitized, and reborn as a living document. At the heart of this revival was Detective Ava Rossi. To her, a cold case wasn't a failure to be filed away. It was a puzzle waiting for the right piece, and she believed that piece had finally been found. Her first official meeting with Leo Hayes, after the initial shock of the discovery, was profoundly different from his past experiences. She didn't treat him like a fragile, grieving relative to be managed. She treated him like an expert witness who had been studying a single complex subject for 20 years. She came to his house, a gesture that stunned him. He hesitated for a moment, then led her to his case room. He expected a flicker of pity or judgment at the sight of the walls covered in maps, notes, and photos connected by a web of string. But Rossi showed none. She studied the walls with a look of intense professional interest. "You've done incredible work here, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice filled with genuine respect. "You've kept this alive. Now I need you to walk me through it, all of it, from the beginning." For the next 3 hours, Leo did just that. He spoke uninterrupted, pouring out 2 decades of obsession, of theories formed and discarded, of late-night connections that seemed brilliant in the dark but dissolved in the morning light. He detailed his long-held belief that the ex-boyfriend, despite his alibi, must have been involved. It was the only theory that had ever made any sense to him, the only narrative that gave a shape to his grief. Rossi listened, her pen scratching across a notepad, her questions sharp and insightful. For the first time, Leo felt like he had an ally, not an adversary. A cautious, fragile hope began to take root in the barren soil of his cynicism. Meanwhile, the 2 pieces of evidence found in the prosthetic leg began their journey through the forensic system. The scrap of denim was sent to the Oregon State Police Crime Lab in Portland. In 1996, forensics would have been limited to blood typing or fiber analysis. Now they were searching for something far more specific: touch DNA. The lab technicians were told the fabric had been sealed in a dark, dry, hollow tube for 2 decades, a nearly perfect vessel for preservation. The tests confirmed what Leo knew in his heart. The fabric was an exact match to the denim of the jacket Amelia had owned. They also found traces of DNA from at least 2 other individuals. One was Amelia's, the other was a degraded sample from an unknown male. It wasn't enough to create a full profile, not enough to run through a database, but it was there, a microscopic ghost. The second piece of evidence was the series of numbers scratched on the back of the ID. To the naked eye, they were barely legible, a random-seeming string, 4P, 8L7. A team of forensic imaging specialists photographed the card under different wavelengths of light, enhancing the scratches, making them clear and undeniable. It was a license plate. Rossi ran the plate through the current DMV database and came up empty. Then she took it to the archives, a place where old vehicle records were stored on microfiche and in nascent digital files. After 2 days of painstaking searching, a hit came back. The plate belonged to a 1988 Volvo 240, dark blue. The car had been registered from 1988 until mid-1997. The registered owner was a man named Alistair Finch. Rossi felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the first truly new lead in 20 years. She dug deeper. The records showed that in August of 1997, less than a year after Amelia's disappearance, Alistair Finch had sold the Volvo, not to another driver, but to a scrapyard on the outskirts of Eugene. The car had been shredded, its existence erased. Rossi drove to Leo's house to deliver the news in person. He saw the look on her face when he opened the door and knew she had something. He led her back to the case room, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. "Leo," she began, using his first name for the first time. "We traced the license plate." He held his breath. It was registered to a 1988 Volvo. The car was scrapped in 1997. The owner was Alistair Finch. The name landed in the silent room with the force of a physical explosion. Alistair Finch, the quiet, polite watchmaker, the concerned father. Leo stumbled back, gripping the edge of his desk for support. His mind, which had spent 20 years running down the same well-worn path of suspicion toward the ex-boyfriend, was violently thrown off course. It was as if his entire map of the past had just been set on fire. He stared at the small, grainy photo of Alistair pinned to the corner of his wall. The face, once just a minor character in his tragedy, a footnote in his investigation, now swelled to fill his entire vision. The polite smile seemed to twist into a mocking smirk. The wire-rimmed glasses seemed to glint with a terrible, hidden knowledge. He was back on that porch 20 years ago. He could feel the damp air, hear the quiet, firm voice of the man turning him away. "My son is a sensitive boy. I will not have him distressed further." It hadn't been a father protecting his child. It had been a killer protecting his secret. Leo felt a wave of nausea so intense he thought he would be sick. He had been so close. The truth had been right there, standing a few feet from him, breathing the same air. And he had turned and walked away. The guilt of that moment, a moment he had barely thought of in 2 decades, now crashed down on him with the weight of 20 years of failure. His entire theory, the bedrock of his obsession, was a lie. He had been wrong about everything. He looked at Rossi, his face pale, his eyes wide with a new, horrifying understanding. The shadow he had been chasing for half his life had the wrong face. Now he knew its real name. Rossi watched him, giving him the space to process the seismic shift. After a long moment, she pointed to the picture of Alistair on the wall. "This man," she said, her voice steady and hard as steel, "has been lying to you for 20 years. It's time we find out why." The hunt for a nameless, faceless phantom was over. The hunt for Alistair Finch had just begun. With a name and a face to anchor the investigation, Detective Rossi's team began to move with purpose. The target was no longer a ghost. He was a 72-year-old retired watchmaker named Alistair Finch. They began by excavating his life, digging through 2 decades of records, searching for a crack in the pristine facade he presented to the world. They found nothing. His financials were in perfect order. His neighbors described him as a quiet, kind, elderly man, devoted to his late son. He was, by all accounts, invisible. Rossi knew this kind of perfection was its own form of camouflage. The only way to find the truth was to confront the man himself. The first official interrogation of Alistair Finch took place in a soft interview room, a deliberate choice by Rossi to avoid the sterile, intimidating feel of a traditional interrogation room. Alistair arrived voluntarily, walking with the slight stiffness of age, his expression one of weary confusion. He wasn't the monster Leo now envisioned. He was a grandfatherly figure who looked utterly out of place. Rossi began gently, walking him through the discovery of the prosthetic leg, the charity, the hidden compartment. Alistair listened, his hands folded calmly on the table, his gaze steady. When she finally produced a photo of the ID card, he simply nodded, his expression turning to one of deep, sorrowful regret. And then he began to speak. His story was a masterpiece of deception, a carefully constructed narrative woven around the inconvenient truths he could no longer deny. He told them that, yes, he knew Amelia. She was a sweet girl, a friend of his son, Daniel. In the weeks before her disappearance, he had given her a ride home a few times, along with Daniel, after their study sessions at the library. His old Volvo, he explained, was a mess, cluttered with tools and books. Amelia must have dropped her ID, and it must have slipped down between the seats. He claimed that he found it a few days she had been reported missing, and he had panicked. His voice was filled with a convincing shame. "You have to understand," he said, his eyes pleading with Rossi. "I was a single father. My son, Daniel. He was so fragile. The police were everywhere. The news was full of it. I found the girl's ID in my car. What was I to think? What were going to think? I was terrified they would suspect me, suspect my son. I made a terrible mistake. I was scared, and I hid it." He explained that he'd put it inside the prosthetic leg because it was the one place he knew no one would ever look. It was Daniel's private space, in a way. He'd intended to get rid of it, to throw it in a river, but he could never bring himself to do it. It felt disrespectful to her memory, so he just left it there, a secret born of fear. He looked at Rossi, his eyes welling up. "I have lived with the shame of that cowardice for 20 years. I am relieved, in a way, that it is finally out." The performance was flawless. He admitted to a lesser crime, panicking, hiding evidence, to absolve himself of the greater one. He had taken every piece of incriminating evidence and wrapped it in a plausible, if pathetic, story of fear and misjudgment. Rossi and her team were momentarily stunned. They had him on obstruction, on lying to the police 20 years ago, but his story walled off any path to a murder charge. There was no body, no weapon, and now the suspect had provided a tearful, seemingly logical explanation for everything. The investigation had hit a brick wall at 100 miles an hour. When Rossi relayed the story to Leo, a wave of cold despair washed over him. It was so clever. It was exactly what a guilty man would say, but he could also see how a jury might believe it. The fragile hope that had ignited in him now flickered violently, threatening to go out. "He's lying," Leo insisted, his voice raw. "That man I met on the porch 20 years ago wasn't scared. He was in control. This is just another performance." Rossi believed him, but belief wasn't evidence. They needed more. They needed to find a crack in Alistair's story. Frustrated, Rossi shifted her focus. If Alistair was a dead end for now, she would investigate the only other person in his story, his son, Daniel. Daniel Finch had passed away from complications related to muscular dystrophy a year and a half before the prosthetic was discovered. Rossi's team pulled his medical records, tracing his final year of life. He had spent his last 8 months in a private hospice care facility. Meticulously, Rossi's detectives began tracking down the nurses and aides who had been on staff during his stay. Most remembered Daniel as a quiet, withdrawn patient, often visited by his doting father. It was a dead end until they found her. A retired nurse named Clara Bellwether. She had moved to the Oregon coast after leaving her job. At first, she was reluctant to speak. "Patient confidentiality is something you carry with you even after you retire," she told the detectives who visited her small coastal home. She remembered Daniel Finch, a sad boy, she said, who seemed to be carrying a heavy weight. Rossi sensed her hesitation and pushed gently. "Clara, we believe his father may have been involved in the disappearance of Amelia Hayes. We think Daniel knew something." The name hung in the air. Clara's professional composure wavered. Her gaze drifted to the window, to the gray, crashing waves of the Pacific. She had held onto this for almost 2 years, dismissing it as the confused ramblings of a dying mind. But she had never forgotten the words. Her conscience warred with her training. Finally, she took a deep breath. "His last few days were not lucid," she began, her voice low. "He was on heavy medication. He would drift in and out. He would talk, but not to me. It was like he was seeing someone else in the room." She looked directly at Rossi, her eyes clear. "He got agitated one night. He kept repeating the same things over and over. He was crying. He said she didn't want to come inside. She didn't want to come inside the house. And then he would whisper, 'I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Dad cleaned it all up. Dad always cleans up the mess.'" The word struck with the force of a thunderclap. This single sentence demolished Alistair Finch's carefully constructed lie. He had claimed he found the ID in his car, that his only connection was giving her a ride. But Daniel's dying words placed Amelia right at their front door. And more than that, they implicated Alistair, not as a man who found a lost item, but as a man who performed a cleanup. When the detectives relayed the nurse's statement to Rossi, she felt a cold, sharp thrill of victory. Alistair's story was a lie. The wall he had built around himself had just crumbled. Daniel Finch, from beyond the grave, had just become the star witness in the murder of Amelia Hayes. The hunt was reaching its end. Now it was time for the confrontation. The time for games was over. Armed with the dying words of his son, Detective Rossi knew she had the key to unlock Alistair Finch. There would be no more soft interviews or polite questions. She brought him in again, but this time the room was different. It was a classic interrogation room, small, stark, with a steel table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor. The message was clear. This was no longer a conversation, it was a reckoning. Alistair entered with the same air of weary indignation, but there was a new tension in his shoulders. He saw the room and his facade tightened. He sat down, folding his hands on the table, a shield of calm he had perfected over a lifetime. Rossi began, her voice cold and even. She didn't ask questions. She made statements. She laid out the timeline, the discovery of the ID, the forensic analysis of the denim. Then she laid out his story, the one he had told her about finding the ID in his car and panicking. She repeated his words back to him, making his pathetic tale of fear sound as hollow and rehearsed as it truly was. "It's a good story, Alistair," she said, leaning forward, her eyes locked on his. "It's almost believable. But the dead have a way of talking. And your son, Daniel? He told us a different story." A flicker of genuine panic appeared in Alistair's eyes. For the first time, his composure cracked. "We found his hospice nurse, Alistair, a lovely woman named Clara Bellwether. She remembered Daniel's last days. She remembered the things he would say when he was delirious. He talked about a girl. He said she didn't want to come inside the house. He said Dad cleaned it all up." Rossi paused, letting the words hang in the dead air of the room. "He didn't say you found an ID in a car, Alistair. He said you cleaned up a mess. What mess did you have to clean up?" Alistair Finch stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. The mask was gone. In its place was a face of pure, narcissistic rage. The quiet, grandfatherly watchmaker evaporated, and the monster hidden beneath was finally revealed. The silence stretched for a long, heavy minute before he spoke. His voice, when it came, was no longer soft. It was cold, sharp, and dripping with contempt. "He was always weak," Alistair hissed. "Even in death he was weak." And with that, the dam broke. The confession that followed was not one of remorse. It was a lecture, a proud and detailed explanation of how he had solved a complex problem. He spoke of that night not as a tragedy, but as a failure of his son's that he, as always, had been forced to correct. That night, Amelia had accepted a ride home from Daniel. On the way, Daniel, prodded by his father for weeks to be more assertive, had clumsily invited her inside. When she politely declined, wanting to get home, he became insistent, grabbing her arm. It was a pathetic, desperate gesture. Amelia, startled and annoyed, pulled away from him, telling him to stop. Mortified by the rejection, Daniel had retreated into the house, a mess of shame and panic. He told his father what happened. To Alistair, this wasn't a simple, awkward teenage moment. It was an unacceptable failure. It was a chaotic variable that threatened the meticulously ordered world he had built. He was terrified that Amelia would tell her friends that his son would be labeled a creep, and that the ugliness of the situation would stain his own reputation. So he went outside to handle it. He found Amelia in the driveway, ready to walk to the bus stop. He was calm, collected, trying to smooth things over with his practiced charm. But Amelia was unsettled. She told him his son had frightened her, and that his own intensity was making it worse. She threatened to talk to the dean about Daniel's behavior. In that moment, she ceased to be a person in Alistair's eyes. She became a threat to his control. She had seen the real him, the man behind the mask, and for that she could not be allowed to walk away. His expression hardened. He told her she was overreacting. She stood her ground, and in a sudden, terrifying shift from calm to cold fury, he grabbed her. It was quick, efficient, and silent. There was no struggle that anyone could hear. He was a watchmaker. He understood precision. He took her life in the quiet darkness of his own perfectly manicured garden. The rest was, in his words, a matter of logistics. He put her body in the trunk of the Volvo. He drove to a remote section of forest owned by a timber company. a place he knew from his weekend drives, and buried her in a deep, unmarked grave. He dug himself over the course of 5 hours. He cleaned the trunk of the car with bleach. He kept her ID, he said, not as a trophy, but as a souvenir of a problem solved, a testament to his own intelligence. Ahoy. Year later, he sold the car for scrap, erasing the last major piece of the puzzle. He had committed the perfect crime, and for 20 years, he had been right. As Alistair's chilling, arrogant confession was recorded, Detective Rossi made a call. Leo Hayes was at his drafting table at work, trying to force a sense of normalcy on a day that was anything but. When his phone rang, it was her. He answered, his hand trembling. Leo. Rossi's voice was steady. He confessed. Alistair Finch confessed. To everything. Leo said nothing. There were no words. He dropped the phone onto the desk and leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. There was no cry of victory, no shout of anger, no sob of relief. There was only a profound, crushing silence. The war was over. The 20-year siege inside his own mind had finally ended. He felt the immense weight of 2 decades of uncertainty, of hope and despair, of hatred and obsession, all collapse inward at once. It was the devastating, soul-shattering, and blessed relief of a final answer. The ghost that had haunted him for more than half his life had finally been laid to rest. He didn't know what his life would be now, but he knew for the first time since he was 24 years old that tomorrow would be different. Outside the interrogation room, Alistair Finch, the meticulous watchmaker, was placed in handcuffs, his reign of quiet, hidden evil finally irrevocably over. The trial of Alistair Finch was a formality, a quiet and somber postscript to a story whose brutal climax had already been written in his own arrogant words. With his detailed confession, there was no doubt of the outcome. He sat in the courtroom, a small, gray man in a crisp suit, looking more like a retired academic than a murderer. He showed no remorse, no flicker of emotion, as the prosecution detailed the calculated cruelty of his actions. He simply watched the proceedings with a kind of detached curiosity, as if observing a complex clockwork mechanism that no longer required his attention. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, condemned to spend his remaining days in a world of rigid order, a prison of his own making. For Leo Hayes, justice was not a moment of celebration. It was a quiet, heavy blanket that settled over his life, smothering the fire of obsession that had burned for 20 years. A few weeks after the sentencing, he walked into his case room for the last time. For 2 decades, this space had been the center of his universe, a chapel to his sister's memory and his own guilt. Now it was just a room. Slowly, methodically, he began to dismantle his life's work. He pulled the red pins from the map of Eugene, leaving tiny, wounded holes. He took down the photographs, the newspaper clippings, the timelines, the web of string that had connected his theories. Each piece he removed felt like a weight being lifted from his soul. He packed it all into a single cardboard box, not to be saved, but to be discarded. This wasn't an act of forgetting. It was an act of letting go. He was finally burying the case so he could begin to properly remember his sister. Closure was not the clean, peaceful state he had imagined. The truth had not set him free. It had simply replaced the phantom pain of uncertainty with the real, sharp ache of reality. The endless, horrifying loop of what if was gone, but in its place was the concrete, brutal knowledge of what Alistair Finch had done. He knew now that Amelia's last moments were not of being lost, but of being terrified by a man she should have been able to trust. The horror of it was mundane, pathetic, and that made it all the more obscene. But with this terrible knowledge came a strange and unexpected peace. He could finally grieve the 19-year-old girl who loved poetry and jasmine plants, not the abstract mystery that had consumed him. The story of Amelia Hayes and the bizarre discovery that solved her murder left a permanent mark on the city of Eugene. The police department, humbled by the 20-year-old oversight, instituted a new policy for all cold cases involving missing persons. It was officially named the Hayes Protocol. It mandated that any significant lead, especially one provided by a family member in the initial investigation, must be given a mandatory second review by the cold case unit, ensuring that no quiet voice of suspicion would ever be so easily dismissed again. Amelia's legacy became a promise of diligence for others. Months later, Leo found himself driving through the industrial side of Portland. He pulled up outside the Second Step Foundation, the place where a crack of light had first pierced the darkness. He walked inside, into the same smell of machine oil and quiet purpose, and asked for a volunteer application. He had spent half his life defined by an act of incredible evil, lost in the shadows of the past. Now, he chose to spend his future in the place that had, through a simple act of charity and a twist of fate, given him the truth. He would not be the brother of a murdered girl. He would be a man who, like the old donated machines around him, had been broken, but was now slowly being repaired. The story of Amelia Hayes reminds us that no voice should be silenced forever. Your subscription helps us amplify these stories, ensuring the search for justice never ends for those who can no longer speak for themselves. And let us know in the comments from which city you watched this incredible conclusion.